Hey everybody, today we are going to dive into 3D layers in After Effects. I absolutely love using 3D layers in After Effects. I think they really unlock the true potential that After Effects can offer as a motion graphic program. So let's go ahead and dive right in. I'm going to go ahead and click New Composition, and we're going to call this one 3D Layers. And this is a pretty basic composition. We're going to keep it at 24 frames a second, and we're going to make it 8 seconds. Go ahead and hit OK. And just for some housekeeping, we're going to go ahead and add an assets folder to keep things clean. Now that you have that, I've went ahead and downloaded some PNGs of a forest, and then we'll get back to kind of our rocket ship in a few minutes, but of a couple of forest alpha channels to kind of prove the point here of the 3D layers. So I have a couple assets without a background. As you can see, the black part is all cut out, and they're all of different sizes. I even have a single tree right here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to drag those into my composition, not really worrying about scale at the moment. And I'm going to move my single tree to the top. And as you can see, these are pretty flat at the moment. We don't really have any way of we can kind of fake our zoom with our scroll wheel, but it doesn't really give us any distance or depth. And that's where 3D layers come in. So I'm going to go ahead and transform these into 3D layers. So a normal layer, if I hit position, actually has two values. It has X and then it has Y, which is up and down, as we learned in our last lesson. In this case, we're going to add a third value, or a Z value. Now, 3D in After Effects doesn't extrude the object like you may be familiar with in Autodesk Maya or any other 3D software. But what it does is it gives us access to that 3D space. So I'm going to go ahead and hit my little square symbol here, and this is Activate 3D. So this is allowing us to have those 3 dimensions now, which, as you can see when I drag over that number with my left mouse button, it looks like I'm scaling it, but what I'm actually doing is moving it away from our camera. And we'll talk about cameras in a few seconds. So let's go ahead and activate all the 3D layers. So if I hit P for position, you can see if I hit S for scale, now I have 3D, or if I hit R for rotation, I have 3 different values now I can manipulate and I can create 3D layers with. So this is really good. Now that I have a lot of assets, and I'm going to just kind of move them around a little bit, I want to make sure that I color code them a little bit. So I'm going to hit the little boxes next to them, and in this case I'll make that one green, just so I can kind of differentiate them from one another. That one can be yellow, and then we can keep this one that kind of standard lavender color. All right, so now that we have our scenes, let's go ahead and scale them up a little bit. So we're gonna, just scale this middle one, and I feel like Bob Ross. I'm gonna make a happy little tree, and we're gonna scale this back one up. I don't always suggest us scaling things over 200 or 100%, but in our case, this is just a demo, and that will be okay. And we're gonna color correct these later to kind of match. All right, so now we have our 3D layers, but what we're missing is a camera to activate. So yes, you saw me move this in 3D space, but think of this right now as a camera that's sitting on a tripod that we can't move. So our square, or our composition window, is just like a camera sitting there in a field looking out upon these different kind of trees. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go to Layer, New, Camera. And I'm going to go ahead and layer new camera. I'm going to create a camera. If you're familiar with photography or any filmmaking, you can go ahead and enter the values you wish. I'm going to keep mine the default that it's on right now and hit OK. And when that happens, the camera will actually affect 3D layers. So you don't really have to do much to it. But if I open up my drop down to the camera, you'll see I have things like point of interest, app rotation, just like I could actually rotate a real camera. I have also other things like depth of field, which is really amazing. I have the ability to change the iris shape or the different focal distance within my scene. So I think that's really cool. It mimics the actual real life camera's attributes. So let's just start with some basic stuff. So we have these in space, but it's kind of hard to see our 3D space. So I'm going to do a couple things. First, I'm going to switch over to 2 views, and I want to make these vertical. I want to make them horizontal. And these 2 views are invaluable because this view is a top view by default, and this is my active camera. Now you can see in the top view, if I select that single tree, it gives me a little handle now, and it shows me in relationship to my camera where it is in 3D space. So if I were to take, for instance, that background layer or the midground layer and move it, I can actually see the different planes of my layers. So I'm going to move this one into the scene just slightly. Let's go ahead and duplicate that, Control D, why not? And let's move this to the other side. Maybe move it just slightly back, closer to those trees. And what I'm doing here is just kind of playing with my focal range and my depth in my scene. And when you get the hang of this, you use your move tool up here, the possibilities are really endless. So these could be my very background layers. I need to scale those up a little bit. And I may darken those later to avoid pixelation. So now I have this scene, which looks pretty, pretty normal. I could probably pull up so I can see the grass in the scene a little bit, the ground plane. And what's really cool about this now is I could actually move through this with my camera. So if I highlight my camera and go through it, now you can see I have this kind of illusion of depth. Now this illusion of depth is actually determined by the distance between layers. So if I move this layer back, as you can see, I may need to scale it up slightly, but if I move this layer back and I grab my camera now, you're going to get this more of a parallax feel. So you're seeing over here between the trees, you're actually seeing a little more illusion of distance. And we can kind of zoom in. Now it's a pretty blurry picture once we zoom in, but we would probably most likely stop near this range. And you can see that tree, because I've given these quite a bit of distance between one another, they've actually given me some really cool effects. So this is a really easy way to manipulate your camera, and you can actually keyframe these as you move forward. And I absolutely love that. Now, if I wanted to set a keyframe, I have a couple options. I could go ahead and open my camera. I have position, and I could just simply set a keyframe. Let's move up just a few frames, nothing very big. I could then drag that camera in, and if I hit spacebar, there we go. So if I want that to be slower, I can just move my keyframe out a little bit. Obviously, I'd add eases and things like that. But now I have the ability to kind of animate that. I even have a camera tool, and if you hit C on your keyboard, or if you go up to the unified camera tool, if I go through the different C keys, I'm just tapping C, I get a bunch of other things like a pan tool, which I absolutely love, the pan tool. We have that zoom tool. We have the rotation tool, which doesn't really do us much good because it kind of breaks that fourth wall and it looks fake. And then we have the unified camera tool, which I don't suggest anyone use if they're a beginner because it gets a little messy. But let's go ahead and delete these keyframes and do a pan using our pan tool. So if I have my stopwatch, let me reset that. And I've set my stopwatch right here. That looks pretty good. I'm going to hit C a few times to get to this little crosshair. And I'm going to move up a few frames, and I'm going to just pan to the right. And let's see what that looks like. All right, so what you can see right now is it is panning, but we have a little glitch happening. And I purposely did this because I want to point out where this glitch is coming from. Everyone kind of gets discouraged by the 3D tool at this point, but what's happening is it's actually rotating by unintentionally. You can see we don't have any rotation on our camera, but to fix this, what you need to do is you need to go to Layer, Transform, and find it, and it's very indiscreet. Like it's so hard. You never find this by Googling it, but Auto Orient. And when I go to Auto Orient, you see how this button looks like it's pushed? Well, it's saying it's oriented to the point of interest. So my point of interest could be a layer's center in the back. I want to turn that off. I just want to point this to the center of my composition. And now you can kind of see I'm getting kind of that parallax look without the rotation. So again, for those of you taking notes, that would be Layer, Transform, Auto Orient, and make sure you just fully push the off button. And if we orient it on the path, again, you're going to just get the, and that may work for certain scenes you're doing, you're going to just get this tilt, which I don't think, I think it kind of breaks our illusion. It makes everything look flat. So I do like to, when I'm getting started, go ahead and hit off, okay. It flattens it out, and then there we go. All right. that's the basics, right? If I want to play with depth of field, I can simply hit A on my keyboard, which will bring up the options. I can turn on depth of field, which is rather nice, and I can begin to kind of play with that. So right now we have some distance, so we would have to kind of play with the focal distance, but you can see as I move, for instance, the focal distance, it's going to start updating the other things. So if we up our blur level as well, you see the front tree is actually blurring out. And let's make it extraordinarily blurry so you can see. So now everything in the front is really blurry. And so we could kind of play with this, and we could, you can see the more I move this value, the more things get blurred, which is a really, really cool tool. All right, so now that we have that, we have a couple options. Like I said, we could color correct this, which let's go ahead and do that. Let's try to match these up. So what I could do is I could use like a color correction on curves. I like the trees in the front. I think the forest trees in the back are a little too green for my taste. So I could just simply go to color correction. We could use curves. We could use hue and saturation. Let's try hue and saturation first. And we could kind of change those. Obviously, we don't want purple trees. Those trees match a little better. Now, I like to take down my saturation a little bit, especially if I'm dealing with depth in a scene. And that just is going to give me a little more distance. And if I like this, what I actually do is copy that effect, go to my other effect and paste it. And it saves me a ton of time. Now, you can see it didn't really match up exactly what I was looking for because those colors were different. But at least I don't have to go to the top menu bar. So up here, we could kind of do some atmospheric perspective. And gosh, we could even add, kind of play around and add a little, maybe a haze or a tint to this. So it's really up to you what you want to do. But now we have kind of this forest, which I messed up the little backgrounds, but we have this really cool forest that we're working with. So that's one way we could do it. Now, if we wanted to add a background, what we could do is we could go to our sky, which we've used in a previous project. We can go ahead and put that in the background, and we could scale this up because in our case, we don't need it too much. And actually, I wonder if we could really get this going. So the cool thing about 3D layers is you don't actually have to turn every layer on as 3D. So if I don't turn the 3D on, it won't be affected by the camera. So you can see right now the sky isn't moving. The sky, and honestly, the sky wouldn't move if we stepped like, 15 steps to the right. It wouldn't really move. If we wanted it to move, we can make it 3D. And as you can see, I need to now push it back behind my scene and do a couple of housekeeping things like scale it up. But now, as a 3D layer, we can have it parallax, we could have it move, we could have it, you can see the further back it goes, the more parallax I get, which is really nice. Maybe we'll add a Gaussian blur to it. So let's go to blur and sharpen, and we can do a fast blur too. Those always work well. I like Gaussian blurs though. Those in the background, so we'll blur it out. And so we can have our layers be 3D, and you can see that's a pretty cool effect. And again, the camera works the same way as any other keyframes. If we want to set our graph editor, we would simply grab it. We could separate those values just like we did our other ones, and we can kind of play around with the easing. So I'm going to go in here and use my graph editor. That doesn't have much value change, but the X and the Z didn't because we're not flying back and forth inside of it. So I'm going to just do some random values. We'll get out of there. Now it has a nice little ease at the start, and then it kind of quickly goes into the end. So I probably flip those curves, but you can see the result. And it's it's amazing that these are 2D images. And then, you'll eventually get to a point where you may say, okay, I really dig this. Maybe at this point, I want them to fly in a little bit. So we'll get that camera tool and we'll use our zoom. We'll fly in just slightly. And so now we have, it holds, it gets to this point, it flies in, and then continues kind of like the pan out again. So we can really play with some of these settings. We can even copy these, paste them. So if we wanted to maybe hold on a certain area, we can do that. And we'd always go to our graph editor, make sure we don't have any hiccups, as I like to call them, just kind of flatten them out. And we can actually make animated holds. So if we want to zoom into something and then pan back out, we could absolutely do that. So that's only the basics of the camera tool. We can go so much further for what we have. So just as an example, let me make a new composition. I think this one's going to really impress a lot of people. And we're going to just call this one lights. And we're going to absolutely do some light and shadow here. So instead of a ground plane, I'm going to go ahead and make and you could use an image for this, but I'm going to make a solid. So I'm going to create the solid, and we're going to make it just a bright color so we can see, like a blue. And I'm going to make that a 3D layer, and I'm actually going to rotate this. Now here, I want to rotate this to look like a ground. So I always get these wrong, but when I find my right rotation, I hit 90 degrees. And I'm going to pull this to the ground. This is my ground plane. Now this is a vector square, so I can scale this as big as I'd like. And I'm going to pull it up. And right now we're looking from the top down. So that's like us looking at a floor. And if we wanted to, we could 100% put a wooden floor or a picture of a floor. But I'm going to go ahead and put my tree on top. There it is. And I'm going to make that a 3D layer as well. And I'm going to go ahead and I think I'm going to scale this down just so we can kind of see the results of this. And I'm going to hit P for position, and I'm going to pull this toward my camera in the negative value. And I can go ahead and create a new camera or use the one I have, but we'll create a new one since we're learning. And now I have this tree, right? Now, let's say I want to cast a shadow with this tree. So any layer that's 3D, I can actually go to Layer, New, and I can add a light. Now, if I add this light, we're going to add it to, it's just going to look creepy, but we're going to make it like red just to see it. And when we build a light, we can make a parallel light, a spotlight, a point light, or an ambient light. Now, those of you who've taken modeling for real-time systems or 3D modeling kind of understand the functions of the various lights. I'm going to go ahead and turn on cast shadows, and I'm going to leave everything default. And when I do that, and I have to position my light a little bit, so that's why this top view is really helpful, I'm going to go ahead and position my light to, and I may use my rotations here, to kind of cast on. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. You're probably thinking, well, you turn shadows on and there's no shadows. Well, there's one more step we have to do. Now that we have our light, and I'm wanting that light to be a little brighter, so I'm going to hit AA on my keyboard. And I'm going to go to my light, and I'm going to just brighten that to a lighter color, just so I can kind of see everything. I'm going to play with my cone angle a little bit, and you can see from the top down what it's doing. Maybe feather, just to get that nice diffused area. And now what I'm going to do is, yes, I have shadows on, but my tree doesn't know that it's supposed to cast shadows. So if I hit AA for my material options, you'll notice cast shadows is turned off. Now when I click that, check out what happens. Boom, look at that. It's a tree layer. And it gives us that diffusion. So I can go ahead and blur that with my shadow diffusion from my spotlight layer. I could kind of play around with the angle. I can play around with a bunch of different other options within that. But this is a really powerful effect in After Effects, because what we've just done, if I go to my camera tool and I do the pan, is we've created the illusion that we actually just created a shadow. And that shadow does wonderful things because it gives us that illusion of depth, like this is a 3D object that we have. And you'll notice if I go and now duplicate that single tree, I'm going to just go to my V key for move, and I'm going to just kind of move these into space. You can actually start to really create, build your own forest, right? So you can build a lot of really amazing things. And so this is where the power of 3D and After Effects really sets the programs apart from maybe what you could do in Animate. You could give this illusion in Animate, but the idea that you can have motion blur, you can have depth of field. Let's go ahead and turn on that depth of field. Remember, that's AA, the A key twice. We'll turn on depth of field. and then we'll kind of find our depth of field focal range. And as we move it, you see the little line on the top view moving, and then we'll pump up the value here a little bit until we get blur. So now you can see the focal range is where it's in focus. And as we shift, now we can animate that too, which is really cool. So now we have a really nice, if we go to our pan, and check this out. If I zoom in here, that focal range will change. So I'm gonna hit C a few times. And as I go away or go into the camera, you see it blurs naturally like a real camera would if you had those settings on it. So that is a really amazing kind of function. And again, you don't need to have every layer be 3D, but you have now the power to kind of create this illusion of depth within your motion graphics. So these really add to dynamic backgrounds. And this is a lot what Disney was doing with his multiplane camera back in the day. This set Disney animations apart from all of their competitors because the backgrounds seemed to have these layers and layers of depth, and they were just so much more visually dynamic. So those are the basics of the 3D layers in After Effects, and you can really do wonders with them, especially if we start combining them with our 2D drawn animations, and combine them stylistically with one another. So I hope you enjoyed the lesson, and I can't wait to see what kind of creative outcomes come from you using 3D layers in After Effects. Thanks, everybody.